Tonight. We just came through, we just finished up and passed through Revelations chapter 11. And I said that we were going to have to pull back on the reins and slow down for just a minute as we get into lesson 14. And last week we ended with this thought: tribulation versus great tribulation. Now, we've only been experiencing, I can talk, I really can. We've only been experiencing tribulation up to this point. But the Bible does make a distinct difference in tribulation and great tribulation. And we will see that at the end of the lesson tonight. But before we get there, we're going to go through some timelines. And if you've cheated and looked ahead on your handout, that's always what I did when I was in school. They'd hand me papers, and I'd always look through to see what we were going to be going over. You would have already seen that we're going to go over a timeline of events prior to the rapture, from the beginning of time until now. And then we're going to go through a timeline of events covered so far, the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. And then we're going to look at a timeline of events to come, the second 3.5 years of tribulation, that we're going to be looking at over the next several weeks. And then we're going to talk about that phrase, that catch of phrase, tribulation versus great tribulation. Brother Joe was looking at the handout, and he said, "You're going to go through all of this tonight." Well, the good news is, yes, we are. But the good news is, even though we're starting at the beginning of time and coming all the way through, we've already covered a whole bunch of this. But I think it's important that as we go through the study of Revelation, we've been basically going line by line, verse by verse up until this point, and that's wonderful. But at this point in time, at this juncture, I think this is the key time to where we can see where these events fit in on the timeline of God. And then as we go forward from here on out, as we get into what we are going to start calling the Great Tribulation for the last 3.5 years, you're going to see that there is a paradigm shift in John's writing style in the next chapter of Revelation. We're not going to get into it this evening, but when we do press forward and we get to Revelation chapter 12, you're going to see John's style of writing changes drastically. And we're going to have to go way back to Daniel, and we're going to look at what is known as Daniel's 70th week. Now, those of you that have been through studies on tribulation and Revelation before, you thought, when are we going to talk about Daniel? Well, I'm doing it a little weird. I'm doing it now. I'm going to do it next. But if we want to look first off to understand where we're at in the grand scheme of things. And I think it's important to begin at the beginning. That's always what I tell my kids. Always start at the beginning and then work your way forward. And here, right in the middle of the tribulation, I think we should go back and review this. So in your handout, you can probably see it a little bit better than on the slide up behind my head. But this is just a basic timeline from the beginning of time until present. And you can see here on this timeline about 4000 BC. That's when we believe as Christians, if you believe the Bible, you believe that the earth is only about 6,000 years old if you believe the Bible as it's written. Now, if you are a long day theorist or a gap theorist, if you don't know what those things are, we're going to have a series about that one of these days. But if you just believe that the Word of God says what it is, and that's what we believe, that's what I believe, 4,000 years ago, the beginning. And then about 2,350 BC, the flood. And then we see the Tower of Babel after that. Abraham, the Mosaic Law was into existence in 1500 BC. Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, which is important because remember we said last week that Jerusalem has not been under complete Jewish control since 606 BC. And that's when Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar came in and took over Jerusalem. Jerusalem has not been a Jewish city since that time. They've had Muslims and Jews and Christians, all three. It's not been an exclusively Jewish city. And that's very important because God's going to restore that. We're going to see that towards the end of our study. But right here is the most important thing to all of us, Jesus Christ. This cross represents Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ was born and lived and died. And I had a very interesting discussion with some people over the past couple of weeks. How do we know Jesus was 33 and a half years old when he died? Well, smarter men than I have done the math. and they've looked at the number of times he went to the temple and the number of festivals he attended, and that's how they derive that number, 33 and a half years of his life. But right here, Jesus Christ was born, and then everything changes in the history of man. Everything. Because all of these people back here, they're all looking forward to this event. They're all looking forward to the birth and the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Everything that happened in the temple pointed to it. Everything that was in the law pointed to it. All the kosher things that the Jewish people observed pointed to it. Everything pointed to it. But now we get to look back on it. And so right now, we are in what we call the church age. Now, if you look at the history of the world from the Adam and the dawn of the earth up until the time of Christ, see how long that line is? 4,000 years before Christ is when the earth was formed. 4,000 years before Christ. And what year is it now? It's not a trick question. 2023. So you have double the amount of time before Christ was born as you do since Christ has been born. So 4,000 years elapsed waiting for the Son of God to come, and it's been over 2,000 years now since he came. Now here's just a little FYI. We don't know that it's exactly 2023, just so you know. There was no one there that wrote down December 25th, 0 AD, Christ was born. Matter of fact, Jesus Christ probably was not born on December 25th. That's just when we observe it. But we are looking now, we live in what's known as the church age. That's where we're at. So when we talk about the rapture, and that's the end of the, quote, church age, that is where we are at. Ever since Christ came, he established his church. We talked about that when we went through Acts. Jesus Christ established his church with 12 men, 12 Jewish individuals. One of them was a devil. And then he left. And he commissioned the church to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And then a few short days later, on the day of Pentecost, which we just passed through the Feast of Pentecost, by the way, in case you didn't know, on Pentecost, the church was empowered by the Holy Spirit. And so since that time, we have been in what is known as the church age. So where are we, Pastor David? I would say we're about right here on the edge of that black, in my personal opinion. But just to review a few key events that happened prior to the rapture, some key events that happened. The creation and the fall of man can be seen in Genesis chapter 1 through 4. The great flood, Noah's ark, Genesis 6 through 9. The call of Abraham. Now that's a key and very important time because that is the establishment of Jews, of the Judaism. When God takes his finger and says, "This is my chosen people." Now, why is that important? Because we see those people are far away from God and they're drawn back to God through the tribulation time. And then we see the trials of the Jewish nation, and that is all throughout the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way through to the end of the Old Testament. You see the ups and the downs, the trials and the tribulations, and the follies of the nation of Israel. Also, this timeline of events prior to the rapture, key events that have happened. The life of Christ, which is chronicled, of course, in the four Gospels. We call them synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then we saw the establishment of the New Testament church, and that we just talked about. We saw empowering and Acts, and then the spreading of the gospel throughout the world. And that's primarily what the New Testament is about after the Gospels from Acts into 3rd John. And then Revelation is unique in that it is the only book in the New Testament that is all about prophecy. And when we've talked about the church age, this is where we live, and you can probably see this a lot better on your handout than you can see up here, and that's why I provided those for you. But if you look, we talked about the church age, and remember in the beginning part of Revelation, John sent out these 7 letters to 7 churches in Asia Minor, and we talked about how those 7 churches actually represents 7 parts of the church age. And we talked about Ephesus and Smyrna, and we talked about all these, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. We talked about all of these church ages. Now, where we live right now is right here in the Laodicean church age. It started in about 1900, the Laodicean church age. If you thought, man, the church has just been falling apart for the past 20 years. No, the church has been falling apart since the 1900s, since the early 1900s. In fact, one of my favorite authors of all time, his name is Leonard Ravenhill. If you've never read Leonard Ravenhill, do yourself a favor. Go get a copy of his book entitled Why Revival Tarries, written in 1956. In 1956, Leonard Ravenhill wrote, and I quote, "America cannot fall because she has already fallen." 1956, the great Leonard Ravenhill wrote those words. And if it was true in 56, it's definitely true in 2023. So the Laodicean church age has been progressively getting more and more lax and more lackadaisical and more lukewarm ever since the turn of the century. And I don't mean 2000, I mean 1900. The Roaring Twenties. What was the Roaring Twenties full of? Alcohol, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Just like today, we like to pretend, because all the movies are black and white from that era, that it was a very muted time, and that's a lie. Read your history books and know that Coca-Cola was so popular because what did it have in it? Cocaine. That's why they called it Coca-Cola. So it has been on a slow downward trek since the 1900s. And that's where we're at today in the church ages. And remember, we talked about all of those things that happened in the Laodicean church age. But some timeline of events before the rapture. And this is really what we wanted to get to, not just to review your Bible, but to look at key events that have happened in the Laodicean church age. In 1948, Israel was reestablished as a nation in a little bitty short war that happened. It took just a few days. And Israel was reestablished as a nation. Ever since 1948, the prophecy clock has begun to tick. The last prophecy in the Bible that is spoken of that has to happen before Christ can return is Israel coming back together as a nation. That happened in 1948. My mother was born in 1950. She is 73 years old. I don't math very good, but 75 years ago, Israel became a nation again. That is the last prophecy that has to be fulfilled before the rapture can happen. There's no other prophecy that we are looking for. We're listening for a trumpet now. And if you remember these famous words of Jesus Christ in Matthew 24:38, he says, "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." Now this has been the debate of many a scholar over the generations, and especially since Israel became a nation again and people that were wise to their Bible started to say, well, how long is a generation? Because this is when Jesus is speaking to his apostles and doing what we know as the Mount Olivet Discourse, in which he talks about the future of mankind and he prophesies to the apostles prior to his death. And he gives them a word of prophecy. How long is a generation? Biblical generation, depending on who you ask, is anywhere between 70 and 100 years. So we are at 75 years since Israel became a nation again. And Christ promised that this generation shall not pass from the earth. So that's why we say we're close. But we are not date makers here. We do not guess when Christ is coming back, only to tell you that he is going to come back. All of those things that we just looked at, that timeline of events prior to the rapture, we are on the dead set end of all of that. That's where we are now. That's where we live now. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at, as we look at some things that John writes, and as like I said, his writing takes a little bit of a different form in the next couple chapters. He starts talking about beasts and dragons out of the sea and horns and little horns. We're going to talk about all that, but we're going to show you how all of the stage is set for the tribulation right now. Things that we have read so far about all the world seeing the three witnesses die, for instance, that never could have happened in 1949, the year after Israel became a nation, because even then, people would not have heard it on the news for days. They would not have been able to see it because they didn't have televisions, most of them, in their home. Now, every single person in the world can know exactly when everything happens in the world. We live right now because of technology in the only time in the history of mankind that one man could actually sit in a room and control the world and never get up out of his seat. So the beast, we'll talk about the beast, we'll talk about the Antichrist, and we're going to talk about how I believe, in theory, he can control the world from just a single room. Now also, this is a little bit easier to see on your paper. This is about as good as I could get. But this is what we've looked at so far. So far, we've looked at the first 3.5 years of tribulation. Now, what happened was in 1 Corinthians 15, 51 through 53, 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18, 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 7, we all see Paul writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit about something that we commonly refer to as the rapture. Now, that word rapture is not in the Bible. We talked about that a little bit when we had a little aside lesson one night. But if you read those scriptures when you get home, you cannot deny that he is speaking about the physical, literal rapture of the saved. People say the rapture of the church. I would go further to say the rapture of the saved, because not all saved people are good members of churches. Just remember that. But the rapture of the church, the rapture of the saved, has already happened. And so we saw immediately after that. Now, if you look on this timeline, it's still a little hard to see. But right here on this timeline, we talked about these things. And this is where these things fall in to the tribulation time. The sealing of the 144,000 male Jewish virgins. Remember, we talked about them. 144,000 male Jewish virgins, 12,000 from each tribe of Israel will be sealed, and they will be saved, and they will go out, and they will evangelize. That will happen really quickly after the rapture. Really quickly after the rapture, we will see these male Jewish virgins that will be saved, and they will go out and begin to evangelize. Also, we talked about last week the two witnesses. Now, they didn't show up till Revelation chapter 11. Remember, we didn't talk about them. But I believe, and I think that the Bible points to the fact that they also arrive in Jerusalem really close to the time after the rapture happens. Why do we say that? Even though they didn't show up until Revelation 11 and verse 3, remember, your Bible is written in what we call, for lack of a better term, storybook format, even prophecy. So when you're reading a really good book, everything that happens is not revealed right in the first chapter. Sometimes the author waits until later on, then you find out someone has already been in the story all the way through and you just didn't know it. So that's also important to remember, that God is a literary genius. So anyways, the two witnesses here. And then we see the first seal opened, and we see the Antichrist signs a 7-year treaty. Now, depending on how your mind works, when we went through these parts of Revelation, we saw that the Antichrist signed a 7-year treaty right after that seal was opened, and he showed up. Remember, he's the first horse of the apocalypse. He shows up. So he shows up, the seal is open, he shows up, and he signs a 7-year treaty. And that spans the entirety of the tribulation, that's 7 years. Then we saw the second seal, the third seal, the fourth seal, the fifth seal. We saw all the seals. So it all happens in order. That's why we studied it in order, because it happens just like that. The witnesses, the 144,000, they show up right around the same time as the Antichrist. Now, I will say this. The Antichrist is probably already on the world scene today. Because if we believe that God is going to come back at any moment, the Antichrist has to be prepared already. Remember, the devil does not know when Jesus Christ is returning. The angels in heaven do not know when Jesus Christ is returning. How then, therefore, can the devil be prepared with that man that can fill the role of the Antichrist unless he has someone prepared at all times? Because the devil is not omnipotent like God is and all-knowing. He does not have those same qualities of God. So, We will talk a little bit more about the Antichrist. We've only been introduced to him just a little bit. We'll talk more about him. A few things about the Antichrist that I will reveal now before we push on past the timeline. A few things that we didn't really talk about the Antichrist before. I believe that he will have to be either Jewish or part Jewish. Why? Because in the second half of the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, we see that he goes and he sits in the temple and he proclaims himself God. Do you really think that the Jewish people would allow anyone not of Jewish descent to do that? They've been waiting for 6,000 years. Do you honestly think that if someone that was not Jewish did that they would allow them to be called Messiah? I personally don't. Now, does that say in the Bible? No, but remember, he's the Antichrist. Everything Jesus did, he wants to do to emulate him. So then, we went through all of this. We went through all of the trumpets. We just looked at all the trumpets. All of these things happen in order, just as we went through them. And that brought us up to the middle of the tribulation. Now, you can definitely probably see this one better on your thing. It just goes through in detail everything we've seen so far. All of the trumpets, all of the treaties, all of the horsemen. It just has it all broke down in the first 3.5 years. So far, what we've looked at so far: the rapture, the appearance of the Antichrist, his signing of a 7-year peace treaty, the 144,000 male Jewish virgins saved and evangelized the earth, the 2 witnesses preaching in Jerusalem for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation time. Then we've also seen the seal judgments. We saw famine and meteors and all these things. Then we saw the trumpet judgments, ecologic destruction, demonic destruction. And then we saw the 2 witnesses killed by Satan and then resurrected by God. Now, it is important to remember all these things happen in the first 3.5 years of what we're calling, quote, the tribulation. And I always find it interesting when you're talking to people about the Bible, and they'll say, I believe in the rapture and I believe in the 7-year tribulation, and the first half is not going to be that bad. And then the second half is going to be really bad. Well, can I say, we've already established that over half the earth's population is dead. So even the first 3.5 years are still pretty bad. I mean, people aren't going to be singing and dancing in the streets. I mean, when the witnesses get killed, they will be. But I mean, it's not going to be all hunky-dory. The Antichrist will rule and reign, and he will do so pretty much because people will like him. People won't fear the Antichrist until the second 3.5 years, I don't believe. So the first 3.5 years, you'll have a leader in power that people genuinely like. Remember, Hitler was elected dictator for life of Germany. So people will like the Antichrist. Now, they're not going to call him the Antichrist. They'll call him by his name. You know him? Yeah, president of the world. He's a great guy. He's swell. I'd vote for him twice if I could. They're going to love him. By and large, people will not realize until the second half of the tribulation, they will not realize that the Antichrist is actually evil. It won't dawn on them. And I hate to go back to old Adolf, but if you remember your history, Germany loved Hitler. They thought he was the greatest thing until he wasn't. And then by that time, the average German, what could they say? Nothing. They could do nothing because they had already given him all of this power. So by the time they figured out he was crazy and evil, there wasn't a whole lot they could do about it. It's the exact same thing that's going to happen with the Antichrist. The Antichrist for 3.5 years will be a beloved world figure. But then, what we're going to see in what we're calling the Great Tribulation, the second half, that second 3.5 years, we are going to see amazingly terrible things happen, even more so than what we've already seen. In the next 3.5 years of what we're going to call the Great Tribulation, you're going to see vile judgments. Bold judgments or vile judgments, those are the same things. And we're going to see 7 of those. And then we're going to see what is commonly referred to as 75 days in Daniel. We'll look at that at length. We'll look at Daniel and see everything that happens there. But we're going to see Armageddon happen, and that's going to be when the Antichrist calls out God and says he's tired of his bullying and he's going to kill him. That's what's going to happen at Armageddon. And then they're going to be defeated. We'll get into all that. Here's another thing that you can probably see better on your timeline. These are things we're going to be looking at over the next several weeks in our study at length. During the next several weeks, as we go over these things, we're going to look at several setups, several things that are already in place for all of this to happen. So over the next 3.5 years, we're going to see the audacity of the Antichrist. Something's going to happen in the next few chapters that's going to blow your mind. The Antichrist is going to be killed. And he is going to resurrect by the devil inhabiting his body himself. So for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, the Antichrist is just the devil's puppet on a string. But for the second 3.5 years during the Great Tribulation, the devil himself inhabits the body of the man. So we'll see that. We'll see the audacity of the Antichrist. We'll see a one-world religion. We'll talk quite a bit about that. I will prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that the groundwork for one-world religion already exists. That there is a place that they are going to build a temple, a mosque, and a church, and all religions will worship under one roof. They've already got the building plans in place. It's already got groundwork begun. If you don't believe that we're close, you've got your eyes closed. We'll look at the bowl judgments that are poured out on the earth, and we'll look at Armageddon itself. We are going to look at the Valley of Megiddo, which one general once said that if he was going to wage a war, it would be in the Valley of Megiddo. He said it's the greatest battlefield on the earth. We're going to talk about him and why he said that, and why it's so amazing that he said that, because he didn't even believe in the Bible. So let's look at the timeline of events in the second 3.5 years. Then we're going to look at this wonderful thing called the millennial reign of Christ, the great white throne judgment, the new heaven and the new earth, and then what we label as believers, eternity. So, tribulation versus great tribulation. Why do we have these two distinct things? And we're going to talk about this, and we're going to look at some scripture references in the coming weeks. First 3.5 years always referred to as tribulation. Second 3.5 as great tribulation. Greater intensity of judgments from God and greater wrath of mankind towards God. Everything is cranked up to, it's already been cranked up to 11. It's going to be cranked up to 22 in the next 3.5 years. In the great tribulation, the Antichrist will reach his full power and cause great harm to all that oppose him. There will be no one that will be able to stand against the Antichrist. His true colors will come out, and everyone will hate him, and everyone will fear him, and some people will still love him. So this is what we call pre-tribulation rapture. We're a premillennial, pre-trib rapture of the church. That's what we believe. And this has everything broke down, and we will look at Daniel in hand with these scriptures and this prophecy. Now, we went through all that in the middle of this, and we looked at where everything lies in perspective to tribulation and great tribulation for a very specific reason here. One, because we're going to be not here for a while because we're going to have VBS and VBS things going on. So this is a good place. Also because we're going to see a paradigm change when John starts to write in the next chapter in Revelation chapter 12. And Revelation chapter 12 and verse 1 says this, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered." So we have just gone from talking about lightnings and thunderings and voices and the throne room of God and things that are literal and that we can see and we can understand, to now we begin to see things that have a whole lot more meaning and subtext. It's going to take us a whole lot longer to get through chapters 12 and 13 to understand everything that's going on. And then it also says in verse 3, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them of the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now there are dragons. What does that mean? A dragon with 7 heads and crowns. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his house. Now remember, as we're not going to go into all of this right now, but remember that phraseology, to rule with a rod of iron. We've heard someone else is going to do that, and you'll remember who that was when we go through it. So as we begin to go into all of this, it's going to take a whole lot of time. It's going to take a whole lot of digging and explaining, and there are some theories and there's some facts that we can draw from the next chapters of Revelation, and we're going to look at those at length. But this is a good point to just look at where we've been and how we've gotten there and where we're going. It's important to remember when studying Revelation that there are things that we will never know. And we proved that out when John was caught up and he heard the voice of God, and God told him, do not write that down. So it's never okay for us to just assume that we know everything, because God proved to us in that one sentence that we do not. But we can know a lot. We can see right now in the world around us how everything is in place for the mark of the beast to be unleashed. Quite literally, tomorrow, the governments of the world could say that no man could buy, sell, or trade without a mark in their right hand or forehead, and they could enforce it. When's the last time you cashed a paycheck? I haven't seen money for years. I haven't. I mean, I know it exists. I know they tell me there's some in my account. But how often do you actually handle money? And do you even need to anymore? How many places do you go that has a sign up that says, no cash accepted? If you haven't seen that, you haven't been to a ballpark recently or to a stadium where it says, no cash accepted. It's not a stretch to think that all the things that happened over the last 3 years with COVID was not just a setting up for what's to come. It was a test. It was a drill. It's a drill of what's going to happen. It's not the beginning of the end. I don't think if you got the vaccine that you got the mark of the beast or robots in your body. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that everything that happened unknowingly and unwittingly, in most cases, was all just a dress rehearsal for the end. All the systems are in place. Nothing else has to happen. We could literally wake up tomorrow and one man could rule the world, and there would be nothing that anyone could do to stop him. You think about that when you go to bed at night. We do not have freedom. We have the illusion of freedom in America. Remember that. They know everything you do. They know everything you buy in the store. How is it that Facebook can suggest things to you that you never asked them about? How is it that Walmart will send me a reminder to go and buy eggs? They know everything. Is it benign right now? Yes, but will it all come into play in the tribulation? Absolutely. But we don't have to worry about that. I'm not telling you to go and be preppers. I'm telling you to prepare people for what's to come. I'm not telling you to go and dig a bunker and hunker down, because I want to be in heaven. You can build a bunker if you want. That's fine. Maybe some lost soul can hide in it during the tribulation. But I don't plan to be here to need 5,000 gallons of water in 5 cases of ramen noodles. I want to be sitting at the marriage supper of the Lamb. So we should be preppers in the sense that we're preparing the lost for what's going to happen. When you look at concrete, factual evidence that's not theory, when preachers used to preach the book of Revelations in the 50s and 60s, people would think they were fools because there is no way that any of this could happen. We cannot say that now. They can turn your car off from space if they don't like what you're doing. Whenever I lose my keys, I get on my phone, I hit my app starts my car and unlocks it. It's great. Newsflash, I'm not the only one that can do that. Whoever owns the app can do that too. They can control every aspect of human life, and the Antichrist will. The next 3.5 years, the Great Tribulation, we will not only see God's judgment on the earth, but man run amok. All the worst aspects of man you will see. All the worst things that we could do to each other, you'll see. And I believe personally that it will be broadcast for everyone to see when Christians are beheaded. Why will they behead Christians? Because it's cheaper than a bullet. Remember that. You'll see people just deteriorate even more than they have. That's why it's the Great Tribulation. Let's close in prayer. And I want to ask Brother Brett, would you dismiss us in prayer this evening, sir?
Father God, the message of Revelation, truly it's astounding, unbelievable. Sometimes hard to listen